Hello everyone, myself Sukrishna. In this video, I am going to explain about queue activities like get transaction item activity, set transaction status activity, and set transaction progress activities in UiPath Studio. So let's get started. To start processing the queue items, we can use the get transaction item activity. This activity will change the queue item status from new to in progress, and after completion of our business logic, we need to set the status by using the set transaction status activity. For this activity, in the queue name section, we need to mention the queue name in which queue we need to get the queue items for processing. So let's understand which queue items will be processed first. Here in UiPath Orchestrator, in the test queue, I have added 10 queue items. All are same priority. So which queue item needs to be processed, it depends upon the multiple scenarios. So let's say in the queue, for all the queue items, we have added only one priority, either low, normal or high. In that case, first added queue items will be processed first. In the second scenario, we have added different priorities. So in that case, first it will process high priority queue items, and then normal priority, and then low priority queue items. In the third scenario, we have added only one priority for all the queue items, and we have mentioned the deadline. So in that case, by using the deadline logic, the queue items will be picked up and processed. In the fourth scenario, we have added different priorities and we have mentioned the deadline. So based on the priority and deadline combination, the queue items will be picked up and then processed. In case if you mention the postpone date, after completion of the postpone date only, the queue items will be picked up and processed. In case if you want to process specific reference queue items, we can do that as well. In this all these scenarios, whatever the combination is matches, so with the matched result, first in first out queue items will be processed. So if you want to process a specific reference, so here you can mention the reference. So here we have filter strategy is available. So you can mention the start with and equal. So based on the filter that we apply, so in case if the reference number is matches, those queue items will be picked up for processing, right? So the output of the get transaction item will give us the transaction item. So let me create a variable here. So in this variable, basically we will have all the queue item related information like reference number, retry number, queue name, due date, postpone date, and all other information is available, right? So let me take one log message to display the reference number. Transaction item dot reference, right? Let's save. Let's run the process and see. So in the output we can see the reference number ending with 559 and work ID 2. So let's go to the UiPath Orchestrator. So let's refresh. So the first added queue item has been picked up for processing, right? Now let's see if we mention the reference number, how this get transaction item will pick the queue item. So here I am going to copy this reference number. For the get transaction item in the reference section, I am going to mention the reference number. In the filter strategy, I am going to mention start with, right? Now let's save and run the process and see which queue item will be picked up. So the same queue item has been picked up, right? So let's go to the UiPath Orchestrator. Let's refresh. So the same queue item has been picked up, right? With this reference, we have only one queue item is available. So let's rerun the process and see what will happen. So let me put a breakpoint here and let's run. So in the output panel we can see no transaction data, right? So if you mention the reference number, with that reference, if any queue items are available, only those queue items will be taken for processing, right? So let's stop the process. After completion of our business logic to set the queue item status either successful or failed, we can use the set transaction status activity. So for this activity, in the transaction item field, we need to mention the transaction item variable. In the status, we have two types are available, successful and failed. In case of any business exception or system exception, we need to choose the failed option. In case of transaction item processed successfully, we need to choose successful. Here, if you want to mention additional details like analytics and output data, you can use these options. So let me add invoice number here. Right. The output I'm going to mention PO number. In case of any business and system exception, so you can mention the details and reasons as well, right? Now let's save and run the process and verify the output. Now the process execution has been completed. So in the output we can see the reference number ending with 540, right? So let's go to the UiPath Orchestrator. So let's refresh. Here the reference number ending with 540 queue item status has been changed to successful. So if you go to the details, so here you can see output data and analytics data, right? Now let's change the status to failed, and in the reason section we need to mention the reason for the failure. So here I mentioned test business exception. So in the transaction error we need to choose error type, either business exception or application exception. So if you want you can mention the details. So here I am going to mention the same reason, right? Now let's save and run the process and verify the output. So the processed queue item reference number is ending with 525. So let's go to the UiPath Orchestrator. The reference number ending with 525. So the status has been changed to fail. And if you go to the details, so we have output data, analytics data. So here we have a reason and details, right? So here you can see the exception type is business exception, right? Now I am going to change the error type to application, and here I am going to change the reason system exception, and I am going to copy the reason. Now let's run the process. The processed queue item reference number is ending with 592. So let's go to the UiPath Orchestrator. The reference number ending with 592 status has been changed to failed, and if you see the exception type is application, and if you go to the details, so we have PO number, invoice number, the reason is test system exception, right? Set transaction progress activity is used to mention the messages like which logic is success, failed, and why the transaction item is taking long time to process. So basically to mention the custom status messages, we can use the set transaction progress activity. Usually for the long running processes like document understanding processes, we will use this set transaction progress activity in case if the documents require manual validation. So here we need to mention the transaction item variable. In the progress, we need to mention the custom status message. So here I'm going to mention the message like manual validation is required for P1 number, right? So let me put a breakpoint at set transaction status. So let's run the process. 570. So let's go to the UiPath Orchestrator. So let's refresh. So the reference number 570 is in progress, and if you go to the details, so here we can see the progress message that we mentioned for the activity. Manual validation is required for P1 number, right? So let's continue. Here for test underscore unique reference queue, I have added the same queue items. So let's see how we can process these all queue items in the UiPath Studio. The requirement is in the reference number, if we have a work ID 1, that should be application exception, the status should be failed. If the reference number contains work ID 2, then that should be business exception. For other scenarios, the status should be success. So let's see how we can implement this logic. Take get transaction item activity. So here in the QNAME section, we need to mention test underscore unique reference. So the output of the get transaction item will give us the transaction item, right? So as we are processing all the transactions, so we need to check the queue items are completed or not. So for that I am going to take a flow decision. So let me search for flow decision. So here I am going to mention condition transaction item is nothing, means all the queue items has been processed, and I am going to take one log message. So I am going to mention the message as process completed. Then I am going to take one more log message to display the processing reference number. So transaction item dot reference. Then I am going to take flow decision to check processing reference number contains work ID 1. So here I am going to mention the condition transaction item dot reference dot contains work ID, right? Click on save. So if reference contains work ID 1, so that should be system exception. So here I am going to take one sequence. So, so let me name it as system exception. So here I am going to take a set transaction progress, your transaction item variable. So in the progress I am going to mention system exception logic, right? Then I am going to take a set transaction status activity. So in the transaction item I am going to pass the variable. In the status I am going to choose failed. In the reason, I'm going to mention the message as system exception. So the error type should be application. In the details, I'm going to mention the same message system exception, right? So to check the business exception, I'm going to take another flow decision. So let me rename it. So here I'm going to change the condition. So let me copy this sequence. Let me rename it to business exception. So here I'm going to change the progress business exception. So the error type should be business, right? So for other scenarios, the status should be success. Let me change the name success. Success logic. So status should be successful. So here we don't need to mention details and reason, right? So after completion of each transaction, again we need to get the transaction details, right? So for that I'm going to give a connection to the get transaction, right? So first we will take the transaction details. So if no transactions are available, so the process will end here. So if the transactions are available, we will log the reference number. So in the reference number, if we have a work ID1, so that should be system exception. If we have a work ID2, that should be business exception. For other scenarios, the status should be successful. Alright. So let's save and run the process and verify the output. Now the process execution has been completed. If we go to the output panel, we can see the process reference number, transaction started and ended message, and at the end we can see no transaction data, process completed message, right? Now let's go to the UiPath Orchestrator. So let's refresh. So here for work ID1, the status is failed, and if you go to the details, so system exception logic, the reason is contains system exception, and if you see the work ID2, we have business exception logic, and we can see business exception message. And for other scenarios, so the status is successful, right?